Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Tony Rock. I'm the VP of Business Development for LockPath. I coordinate our channel partners, advisory partners, and our technology partners, which includes our friends at Digital Shadows, and who will be our collaborator for today's webinar. So today joining me is James Chappell. James is the founder and CTO at Digital Shadows. For 20 plus years, he has been leading teams and providing thought leadership in the areas of InfoSec and cybersecurity. His passion is delivering innovation to help organizations effectively identify their digital footprint so they can improve their risk, compliance, and security profile. Before we get started, kind of quickly walk through what we're going to discuss today. James is going to give us a background on what we believe is a very important topic in the marketplace today around digital risk. We'll talk about 7 categories of digital risk and how it's working in the world of risk, compliance, and security. We'll talk a little bit about the issues and opportunities to work more effectively in managing digital risk, and then we'll follow up with Q&A. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to James.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tony. Hello, everyone. It's great to meet you all. There'll be questions and answers you'll be able to ask as we go throughout. So if you have questions as they come up, please do ask them in the window, and we'll answer those at the end of the presentation. So it's great to talk about this topic. Digital risk is an interesting term, and I guess it's one that's entered our dialogue more recently. I thought I'd share this diagram that comes from a Gartner paper on integrated risk management. So there's a gentleman called John Wheeler there, who's been talking about integrated risk management. And really, his observation and Gartner's observation overall is that businesses are complex. They have complex business operations. There's regulatory commitments, and IT and technology-based risk and cybersecurity-based risks are often discussed in sort of different areas. And it's useful for boards to set out different risks in the context of the overall operational risk management framework. And I really like this diagram because it sort of sets out different types of risk that a board is going to need to deal with. Gartner have been recommended this sort of more integrated approach to risk management, which tries to understand some of the interrelationships between things like cybersecurity and technology risk and operational risk and what they're terming digital risk. I think Gartner first started using this term in 2007, but I think this paper, this diagram and this paper and a blog that was recently produced as well, looks at the risk from digital technologies. And it specifically talks about risk from third parties, the way that social media is changing our world, the fact we're more mobile, the fact that we're dealing with larger amounts of data than before, and the number of devices connected to the internet and the use of cloud technologies all play a role in the risk management frameworks of any business. So I think, it's interesting to see people like Gartner talking about risk management in this holistic sense, but recognizing that digital risks are an important component in the overall risk management approach. So if we do think about the digitization of business, it's possible to argue that there's these amazing benefits that all businesses are seeing from becoming more digital. So that could mean, the reduction in cost from using really inexpensive computing resources on the internet or the cloud, the kind of hyperconnectivity we get from things like social media and mobile, and being more mobile, and then looking at, the way that, the number of devices connected to the internet exceeded the number of people as long ago as 2011, and it's not getting any better. It's becoming much, larger. And there's tremendous opportunity for businesses. You're either going to make business more profitable, going to save money, or we're going to do things differently. So here, I've been sort of thinking about this area and thinking, well, the digital footprints that organisations have are very positive. You want to have a digital footprint. You want to have that information online. But also the way we need to think about risk has changed. And I've been using the term digital shadow to refer to the risks to an organisation, so that how organisations can become exposed, or that online services or information lead to a risk for a business. So when I think about digital risk, I'm often thinking about that digital shadow. And you can actually see on things like Google, you can go onto Google and type in this phrase here, confidential, not for distribution, file type PDF. You're going to get, in this case, about 300,000 results of documents that are indexed by Google that really aren't there. So those digital shadows, this digital risk, really does exist. It's a real thing, and it's not going to go away. And there's a gentleman called Johnny Long who created this concept, and he's got many more of those types of queries. But how do these things happen? Well, one of the things that I've been watching since about 2007 was a group called the Jericho Forum. They've been talking about a concept called deperimeterization. And the basic concept that sits behind that is that you've got your castle walls around your business built higher and higher. You keep all the crown jewels inside those castle walls nice and safe, and all of the attacks and problems can bounce off those protective controls. But the truth is, we now have these lengthening supply chains. Our suppliers have our customer data, they have our partner data. Their suppliers have suppliers, those suppliers have suppliers. Those supply chains are much longer than ever before. And as many people recognise, we've got these amazing new services that can deliver things like CRM or HR systems at minimal cost, either through infrastructure or platform as a service, the cloud. We're more mobile, and we're just more connected than we ever have been before. So all of that information now lives on the outside of businesses in a way that it hasn't done, never did before. And this really does create new risks. So all of that data is online in a way that it never has been before, and that's a really interesting challenge. I thought it might take you through some very specific examples of this. So I want to talk about 7 categories that digital risk occupies. This isn't necessarily exhaustive, but we'll give you some idea. So here we've got the 7 categories. We've got cyber threat, data exposure, brand exposure, third-party risk, exposure of important people in your business, physical threat, and infrastructure. I want to give you an example of each one of these. So we look at threat to start with. What's very interesting is if you look at digital footprints, threats themselves have digital footprints. What you can tell from those digital footprints, for example, if you looked at, if you're a sponsor of, say, a big sporting event such as the World Cup, you can actually learn a lot about previous threats to businesses by looking at the previous World Cup. And there's actually a good chance that some of those things will happen again in the next one. So we can sort of look at the digital footprints and how of hacktivism. We can look at how crimes were committed, point of sale theft. We can look at how identities were manipulated online, and we can learn about what are typical types of threats by looking at those digital footprints. So in some cases, these footprints can help us inform ourselves about our risks. We get a deeper understanding of threat, which helps us understand risk in more depth. And it's about not only the sort of timeline of things that happen, but it's the relationships between the types of actor, the types of techniques that we see being used, and the types of campaigns that we see being run. I'll give you an example of a anonymous campaign there that was used in the Sochi Olympics, which may well feature in the upcoming World Cup games in Russia. So you can tell a lot from digital footprints about risk to your business. And it will be as unique. It will be very unique. So the next one is looking at example of data exposure. So here we have, some of you might remember, in 2017, GitHub announced a breach of its code repositories. So it used GitHub, Uber uploaded code to the code repository GitHub, and when it used that for developing its services. Included in some of that information was a key to a database, and someone opportunistically used that key to access customer data. And basically about 57 million customer records became exposed online, and 600,000 driver details became exposed online. Joe Sullivan was the CISO at the time. It actually led to him moving on. This was an example of where a technology platform was being used to provide useful services to the development team. Unfortunately, some sensitive information got onto it. It wasn't protected appropriately, and it landed up leading to a major data breach for the organization. If we look at how identity is used online, this also can be quite serious. So a very recent example of this is where President Macron in the French elections had a news article published about him on a fake version of a Belgian newspaper called Le Soir. And lesoir.info was the false domain, and lesoir.be was the genuine one. Most readers online didn't recognise the difference between those two. It actually led to Marine Le Pen, the opposing candidate, tweeting the false information online. Disinformation now plays a role in lots of different scenarios. So basically, disinformation is now very common, and it's been around, not since we've been using the term fake news, but it's been around as long as we've had fake Amazon reviews, for example, or fake reviews for restaurants. Disinformation has existed for decades. It's just now digitally we can enable those. We recently wrote a paper that looked at the creation processes, the way that you create false content, the way that you then publish that in a way that it's accessible by many people, and then the way that that information is propagated online. So whilst fake news is kind of a trendy topic at the moment, disinformation has played a role in digital risk for many, many years. And it's certainly something that when you're looking at brands, rather than sort of worrying about what customers are saying in terms of being disgruntled, actually looking at how identity is being disrupted online to have serious effects to a business is very interesting. So if you look at things like recent initial coin offerings for Bitcoins, for example, you can see places where major frauds have taken place just by impersonating a legitimate website where a major financial event is taking place. Another example is where the supply chain gets involved. So many of you might have a place where you back up your movies and music at home, and these home storage drives are not an uncommon way of doing that. So there's about 50 or 60 devices that you can buy for your home network. You can go down to your local computer store and collect one of these drives, and then you can take a look to see, you use it to back up your important files. We've seen a few examples where a contractor working for a business has decided they've run out of space on their laptop. They've decided, crikey, I need to find a place to back these up. Oh, I know, I'll back it up to my home storage drive. Unfortunately, some of these drives, of about the 60 or so ones that are out there, there are about 5 which are just leave themselves open to the internet via a protocol called UPnP, and you can actually see lots of files appearing online on these devices. So it's really not a great situation when you see this. Another example is infrastructure. Here's a nice picture of a swimming pool. This happened to be a hotel, a 5-star luxury hotel. This swimming pool had its controls accessible from the internet, and someone took advantage of those controls and dispatched too much chlorine into the pool, leading to the swimming pool to be closed down and leading to a loss of business from that area of the hotel. It's not uncommon to see infrastructure exposed online like this, and there's services like Shodan or Sensis or others where you can find parts of businesses that have technology that is exposed online which is not useful. It might have a useful use for maintenance, but it can actually cause a risk to that business. So understanding the complete digital footprint of that business from an infrastructure perspective is really, really important. Another example is where, unfortunately, VIPs get exposed in data dumps. So we've seen a lot of cases where the membership of either fairly salacious websites, such as Ashley Madison or Adult Friend Finder, have been put online, and sometimes falsely profiles have been placed on those websites, but have led to an embarrassing incident for an organisation. Equally, looking at things like the OPM database that people are legitimately members of. Anyone who works in the US federal departments were in that database. That's 21.5 million records that were leaked in one go, and that changes the risk picture for that organisation. Once that data's out there, it's out there. It's very hard to get back. So making those people aware that they're breached is really, really important. Another thing we see a lot of is things like exposed credentials online. So there's something like 5.5 billion username and passwords combinations available online. We did a study, we found 97% of the Forbes Global 1000 actually had usernames and passwords online. And people are people, they generally won't change passwords or use the same passwords for different websites. We see these credentials being routinely used by attackers to break into companies. One other area we've seen a lot in is looking at how buildings themselves get exposed. So looking at places where the plans for a building might be shared inappropriately. And in one particular case, we found a project file store that was just sort of open to the internet via an FTP service, file transfer protocol service. And unfortunately, the company had forgotten to place the authentication controls on that. And with this kind of information being available, it's quite useful for someone who wishes to compromise security or learn about how to get into a building in a meaningful way. So this is an example of a digital risk becoming a physical risk in a way that you wouldn't normally expect. Normally this stuff, the two areas sit very separately. So again, back to Gartner's point, the idea of considering risks in the round in a more integrated way is incredibly important. So I've given you a few examples there of different categories of digital risk. I wanted to pass over to Tony now to talk about, well, given all these digital risks out there, what is it that we should be doing as professionals to manage those?
Thank you, James, and thanks for the lead in. So, James, as we've been, talking through this, the last few weeks now, thinking about digital risk, certainly digital risk or digital transformation, has been occurring since, for all of this century, and the unintended consequences of the opportunities, uncertainties, and threats and so forth facing organizations today. One of the challenges when a new category is being brought to market, in this case, propagated through Gartner and some of the other analysts in the marketplace, is what do we do with it? Meaning that as technology enablers and practitioners on the line today, how does this affect our particular organization? And one of the challenges that we always have is that, for for people outside our domain, other people with actually in the businesses and running the business themselves, is the eye roll. It's like, oh, what next, right? What else is that we have to deal with from a a cyber risk or compliance, et cetera, standpoint, right? And so the analogy I always used to talk about is thinking about back in my days of public accounting, when you would do projects around SAS 70 or ISO or agreed upon procedures, and there was always that language in the report that says, had we performed additional procedures or looked at additional data, this may have changed our findings or recommendations. And really, this is what we're talking about here, is a simple way to communicate this within the organization, thinking that all the risk areas, that the 7 areas that you've outlined, if we were to aggregate those into a framework for risk management, which is a standard probability and impact approach, organizations either overtly or indirectly do have a digital risk profile, and they probably have certain assumptions around that. But as additional information comes into the organization, here what we call digital risk content, and that could be structured data, unstructured data, whether it's computed manually or through AI, it really doesn't matter. The fact is, new information is coming to the analysis, which ultimately may change how an organization looks at their potential exposures from both an impact and liability standpoint. And so really the key point is that digital risk indicators, while they've always been out persistent with the organization, now it's well known within other parts of the organization, just outside traditional information security teams. And so organizations can no longer look at this information from or deny this information from a risk standpoint. They need to start dealing with it, which means that the gap between where they think they are today and where they actually are as new information comes on, probably going to be a substantial difference, and we'll need to change how they allocate resources, processes, new technologies, and so forth. But fundamentally, the bigger issue on how organizations are going to be able to deal with digital risk management, it really comes down to what we believe is the risk culture, right? For companies that have strong lines of first lines of defense, right, being able where they have risk, security, and compliance really driven down at the organization levels, the business departments, and so forth, they're the ones that are going to be able to deal with these issues much more rapidly than others. In fact, you could argue that for an interim period, that certain organizations that can recognize the digital risk management issues could have a bit of an advantage over their competitors in the marketplace. Certainly not sustainable, but certainly in the short run could give them some areas of advantage. So here's some of the areas that when we think about digital risk content, particularly content such as, James, what you guys deliver at Digital Shadows, kind of a model of how organizations need to process this particular information. And certainly, a big chunk of this comes down to, the asset discovery phase. And there are various tools out there that can help with this. Bolin scans help deliver data, SIM tools, James, your data can do this, CMDBs, and so forth. But that really forms the basis of really understanding that process of what assets do we think are relevant to our organization, not only just from a technical standpoint, but also, physical and process assets as well. And then how those then get translated into the activities that an organization will face, right? The risk management activities, how that translates into the third-party risk management activities, security and the audit controls, and then finally, as we get down into the delivery and the tech stages, now we're dealing with the activities around incident response and vuln management. And the most important thing here is that this is it's a continuous monitoring process, which is which is a very important principle within the marketplace today and how organizations effectively deal with risk management in general, but certainly the issues and opportunities coming from a digital risk perspective. So we talked a little bit about Gartner, and Gartner has moved away from GRC into the concept of integrated risk management. In fact, in one of their blogs, they will show that integrated risk management, their new framework, digital risk management is one of the domains within Gartner's new integrated risk management framework. The others being business continuity, audit, legal, compliance, and so forth. So certainly it's a domain that we need to be aware of and continue to propagate within the marketplace. But from an enablement standpoint, when we start thinking about technology solutions that deal with these areas, and when we look at digital risk content, typically here's kind of the main areas where we see that content is going to come in. New information that can now be consumed by the risk committees within a particular organization example. And those risk committees are not only at the enterprise level, but also within respective business functions, IT being a big component of that. Certainly, digital risk content can improve the vulnerability management process by identifying assets that are out in the marketplace that we did not think were out there. So it's another avenue of discovery. I think for a lot of enterprise risk practitioners that really focus on controls, risk, and audit type processes, digital risk content can be consumed for controls testing purposes, as well as building new controls going forward. And then certainly what we see in the marketplace is very compelling, is additional context that comes around third-party risk management, because most organizations have a strategic imperative to have high-performing third-party relationships and suppliers, and being able to effectively understand the risk and opportunities those vendors and relationships have to an organization is very important. So certainly, when we think about it from a services architecture for integrated risk management, being able to share this data across multiple functions and activities, the architecture within solutions needs to include things around workflows, being able to take information and route it to the right groups and organizations, being able to integrate with multiple data points, both internally, internal systems within the organization, but certainly being able to consume external content, whether it be vulnerability information, SIM, threat intelligence, social media information, and so forth, reporting and analytics, native assessments, and then certainly, as respect to privacy and other issues today, being able to lock down the information in the systems through strong permissioning applications, which is a lead into, from a LockPath perspective, as a technology enabler for risk compliance and security activities. Our architecture maps well to the integrated risk management approach, and we're continuing to improve upon our platform, particularly in the areas of being able to ingest in data from the deep and dark web, such as James, that you guys provide at Digital Shadows. We typically break down that information and are able to share and consume that information across multiple applications as defined within our platform. And once the information is within our platform, it can then be shared through business rules, workflows, and then certainly be, as that data needs to be reported on and analyzed, all the capabilities are natively built into the platform. With the primary differentiator for us is that we allow organizations to do self-configuration, meaning that does not require a significant amount of resources for technical configuration, and now organizations can actually work with their service providers to focus more on advisory issues, which, for us are focused more on the areas of identifying, areas such as control testing, better assessments, better risk registers, and so forth. Really, that is what we're trying to accomplish in the marketplace.
So thank you, Tony. And I guess from our perspective, really what we're trying to add to this picture is help customers to understand when any of their data is exposed online, whenever there's plans to target a business, that there's a footprint that would suggest that, where supply chain or the employee chain might actually cause a risk to your business, where there might be threats to key members of staff. We see a lot of cases where people are impersonated for the purposes of threat, where you've got your data showing up in places where it shouldn't. It might be the dark web, it might be just criminal websites in general, or whether you've got computers or bits of your infrastructure that might put you at risk. And what we aim to do is do that in a way that doesn't create false positives and means that you can actually take action in each case. So if I had to sum up what Digital Shadows do, this is how I'd phrase it. So we really do try and manage those digital risks on behalf of our customers. I guess there's lots of different ways of managing digital risk, but we've gained quite a good understanding of what's out there. And if you're interested in looking at the scale of some of the data loss side of that problem, there's a white paper that we provide here that talks about the 1.5 billion files that exist online just through sort of open shares and everything from Amazon S3 buckets, which we've seen a lot in the news, just makes up 7% of those 1.5 billion files. There's way more out there, and we produced an analysis of just the kinds of things that show up in those. Of course, it's not just data loss. It is how identity is affected online, it occurs, how infrastructure is compromised, and what common techniques we see out there. But this is sort of one useful perspective. If you follow the links in the right, you'll be able to find out a little bit more about that. So with that, we move forward to our Q&A. And
yes.
Yeah.
So kind of move on through, can leave the final slide on our contact information. So we do have a question in here, James, and kind of paraphrase the question is that based on your experience, and we'll all chime in with ours, what industries and or use cases or processes are you seeing in the marketplace in relation to the data that you guys generate? How is it being used?
Thank you, Tony. I guess it's really interesting. What we've seen is sort of highly regulated industries have really become alive to these risks in a way. They'd be the first people that are sort of alive to these risks. We've been working in this space for about 7 years or so now, and probably the first organisations we ever worked with were in the financial services space. So you've got things like the definition of non-public information under the Graeme-Lee-Byerly Act, and I think that sort of led to a heightened awareness in financial services organisations about things like data loss, things like targeting that might occur online. So if I had to pick one, that would be it. But I would say it does more broadly apply to any business really at all. I mean, every business that I know has a digital footprint. Interestingly, I mean, I don't know what you think, Tony, but I'm not sure that the regulations themselves they talk quite often about monitoring or what goes on inside an organisation, but often they don't. What's your experience? Do you find they talk about what's going on outside an organisation?
The answer is yes, and certainly as we've been talking, both of our organizations for the last year and our conversations in the marketplace. So from an experience standpoint, we need to continue to push the education and awareness piece, which is helping, the organizations, create the awareness around it. If for more advanced organizations, for what I call the leading firms that are really into very mature compliance programs. When I say compliance, meaning that they understand a particular set of frameworks and controls they want to work under, whether it be HIPAA, NIST, or where they want to harmonize across multiple systems. They've got their audit processes mapped against those particular frameworks and control standards. They do a very good job of controls testing. So for those organizations who are looking to continue to be leaders as it relates to information security and cybersecurity, they get it, even though there may not be legally prescriptive that they need to be doing these things. They understand the value of this information, and it goes back to that risk management slide, where understanding that we have an opportunity to really communicate how risk is within the organization as measured by probability and likelihood by putting more data into the equation. Again, it goes back to that concept of when the operational and daily leaders have to deal with these issues, and they report up to senior managers and the board, and they always have to make that clarifying statement. Our analysis around our risk profile is limited to the amount of procedures and data that we had at hand, and typically it comes down to cost or actually what's available. But certainly with the intelligence feeds and the ability for technology firms to process that data, millions. I can't even imagine the amount of data. I mean, you talked about a 1.5 billion, earlier. Being able to process that data through machine learning, AI, whatever. I mean, that just couldn't be done 10 to 15 years ago. So the ability to bring that context into the organization and help them understand that their risk, compliance, and security profiles are probably off based on this new information is very, very important. But primarily for the ones that are more advanced in their processes is what we're seeing. And so again, that will come down to the more advanced industries, FinServ or FinTech, financial institutions, utilities is a market that I know both of us watch closely, especially when we think about the new or the emerging NERC CIP supply chain security standards. We believe the information that you guys provide could be an important part of help filling in the gap as utilities look to implement that particular standard. And again, that is a compliance standard, meaning that failure, when there's a compliance issue, but certainly failure to comply does have some teeth at hand, meaning that they're going to face a fine. James, I'll turn it back to you. Here's another question that just came in. Your thoughts on you guys are in the UK. You're more abreast on the issues around breaches and privacy and so forth, relative to us in the States. Give us your thoughts on GDPR and what you guys do, and how do you see that market progressing?
Sure, no problem, Tony. So it's interesting. So we've been working both the US and the UK now. I think the US for about 5 years, but we've been started out in the UK about 7 years ago. So we do touch on GDPR a little bit more often. I guess everyone's had the 1,000 emails in their inbox from various people going, "Oh my goodness, GDPR, the sky is falling, run for the hills." But the truth is that there is, people are taking this seriously. The way I look at it is as an opportunity. So one of the things that GDPR says, it's all about sort of data. If you hold data on an EU citizen, regardless of which country your business is in, then you need to worry about GDPR. And what we're seeing is that any citizen who discovers their data somewhere where it shouldn't be, and it looks like improper care has been taken of their data, they are then able to file a complaint with a European Union regulator. And that regulator may, through various treaties, go through to another country to bring about a fine. And the fines are quite large, so they're in the legislation, they're stated as 4% of global annual turnover, or 20 million euros, whichever is the higher. We're yet to see what size fines will be handed out. But we gave the example of Uber earlier, so Uber being primarily a US business, but it does hold lots of information on EU citizens. So that example of the GitHub data breach, there's part of the EU Article 29 working party, so these are the folks that define what GDPR is, have made a statement that actually breaches that occurred before May the 25th, 2018 will be considered under the new legislation, and they believe the fines will be proportional for how close to the deadline that event occurred. So there's already some noise, although it's not a fine yet, but some noise being made by the European Union about their intent to make some examples of organisations that have lost data. Of course, data loss is not just a US problem, it's very much a European problem, which is why they created this legislation in the first place. But it's interesting to see them extending that remit beyond the boundary of the EU, actually into other countries such as the US. I guess we'll see, time will tell how successful those attempts are, and but I think it's worth, if you do have legal representation, it's worth chatting through, thinking through what EU data you might have in your business, and actually, going out and auditing what there is out there is actually a sensible idea. It gives you a sense of what because you're not going to be telling you're not going to be confessing your sort of data loss events directly. This is EU citizens who spot the data loss can complain about you rather than you reporting it from a compliance perspective. Then it leads to a very interesting situation. It's better to know what's out there already so you can preempt it rather than waiting for the worst to happen down the line. So there's no sort of burying your head in the sand opportunity there. I think that's sort of definitely not a good approach. It's interesting to see how privacy, is treated differently in different countries. I guess, Tony, you guys worked in the healthcare industry for some time. Do you find that healthcare companies are really looking at this area? Do you think that they're really engaging in this space?
Oh, James, that's a great question, because we just had another one come in related to how can this information be used in the context of breaches, remediation. I'm kind of paraphrasing some of the language here, which comes back to your inquiry on the healthcare side. So this is something that we have been advancing and really trying to find it within the particular compliance frameworks, because really the motivator for a lot of healthcare institutions is around dealing with complying with whatever regulations they have first, and then there's what I call the moral obligation of actually doing the best practices and so forth. And so this comes down to the notion of, in the event that there's you are a healthcare facility, there is an event, right? There's a breach. You've got millions of records of personally identifiable information out in the marketplace, et cetera. How does a healthcare organization respond in that particular case from a remediation mitigation standpoint, meaning trying to understand, okay, this information is out in the marketplace. What do we need to do to quickly ascertain where it is, who's got their hands on it, and then understanding how that can be used either against us but more importantly, understanding the exposure of how that information is going to fall in the wrong hands and eventually be used against the the victims of the data breach. And that is something that we're big proponents of as a use case to help them integrate that into their particular process. I don't know what you guys have seen it within healthcare, but that is an area that we've been trying to champion that right in the event that you do have a breach and nothing's foolproof. Everybody knows that it's not a question of if, it's just a question of when. How do you contain it? And containment meaning that we need to better have a handle on what do we think the estimate of the damage is for one, right? The impact analysis. So we see it bleeding over in terms of incident response, business continuity planning, business impact analysis, and so forth. Well, this is where we'd like to see it, but certainly I think we've got more work to do from an awareness and education standpoint. I don't know what you guys have seen. James, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, it is interesting. So I guess one of the first things that you're trying to establish when you have a security event, i.e. an indication that something might not be quite right, you want to very quickly qualify that to work out whether it is something that's in scope or if it's not. And I guess in a lot of the legislation and regulations, we see people trying to, getting to that point of trying to work out whether a piece of data was accessed by an unauthorized party. So understanding where that data is, what kind of infrastructure it's on, and then asking the next sensible questions to go from a security event into, actually treating it as an incident. So actually handling it from beginning to end as maybe there is something that's bad that's happened here, and then quickly getting to a point where you're establishing whether or not a breach has taken place, and a breach being that unauthorized access by an unknown third party or even a known third party. So having a view of how that appears in a digital footprint is very, very useful. The other side of this, of course, is looking at where you're trying to authenticate claims. So quite often we see, certainly in the case of there's a particular group called the Dark Overlord. So these have been sending ransom requests to healthcare institutions, so some hospitals, a lot of private healthcare institutions where they've claimed to have stolen data and then are threatening to publish it online in exchange for a ransom. In this case, we can sort of do some work to verify the authenticity of the claims and trying to understand in a bit more depth whether this is something that's been seen before or whether this is something that's looks a bit more opportunistic, which can also inform how an organisation is going to respond to that particular incident. So it's not just about sort of spotting breaches that have already happened. It's about validating things that may not actually be a breach, that may have people claiming that they are, and there's a lot of false positives in that space. And then lastly, it's also sort of to your point, Tony, it's about containing them. So if you can spot a method or a means by which is being exploited, you can actually reduce the impact of an incident quite quickly by looking at how data is leaked online, by working with the places where that data shows up. And some places it's hard to remove information from the internet, but if you look at a lot of legitimate websites, if the data's up there, they've got an abuse policy that you can use. You can actually go through a full takedown process with a lot of those providers, and that can really make a big difference to the severity or impact of a breach. And it's a great thing to demonstrate to a regulator too, since they're looking for you to be demonstrating that you're making the right effort.
Fantastic. So it looks like we're coming near to the end, and so this is my question to you, James, or maybe this is really kind of for our perspective at LockPath, and finish up on helping me mold my thoughts as we continue to develop this particular area. So third-party risk management we've talked about this, it seems to be very hot in the marketplace, for lack of a better word, and it's driven for certain industries. It is being driven by by compliance issues. Utilities being one, but just in general, from a business process perspective, we're seeing a lot of activity in this area. So I want to kind of get your thoughts on maybe. I know you had one example, but maybe start thinking. Help me think about specific areas where organizations could use your type of data to either minimize a particular risk or compliance issue, but most importantly, thinking about how do we use this information to actually build better third-party relationships, which is ultimately what organizations need to be doing. And this is what we've been trying to champion in the marketplace.
I think that third-party piece is really important, Tony. So if you think of larger businesses, they have a huge supply chain. I think when you're trying to work out how you prioritize your resources in giving support to those suppliers who are responsible for either managing personal data, PII, or even non-public information, then you can actually work collaboratively with them and present to those suppliers the types of incidents that I've given previously. So things like data loss incidents, evidence of exposed infrastructure, evidence of threat against that organization, or just sort of general threat landscape information about the sector or area that they work in. And I generally find that if you work in a collaborative way with your suppliers, they'll appreciate, intuitive questions asked about risk, because ultimately they should have the same goal as you, which is to, minimize any risk. And provided it's done in the right way, it can be a very, very collaborative process. Of course, you need permission to go and do those things and sort of tell them what you're going to do before you go and do it. But as long as you do it in that sort of way, you should find that you have a useful and productive conversation with them.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up since we are out of questions and coming up near to the end. I do want to thank you, James, for illustrating and educating us on what we believe is going to be an important topic and domain going forward. For the audience, if you have any questions or comments, please reach out to myself or James as listed on this slide here, and we look forward to seeing you again in future webinars. Thank you.